So we're diving into budgeting, right? Got to figure out if this beyond budgeting thing is legit or just another management buzzword.
Well, get this. This whole debate goes way back, like way back.
Way back. How far back are we talking?
Try a century.
A century. Seriously. 1922? Did they even have spreadsheets back then?
Funny you should mention that. 1922, James O. McKinsey, yeah, that McKinsey, wrote a book called Budgetary Control.
Wait, McKinsey? As in the consulting firm. So this budgeting debate has been going on for that long.
Pretty much. McKinsey's ideas were all about planning, coordinating estimates, comparing those to actual performance. He was even advocating for businesses to revise their plans when things change, even way back then.
So no sticking to the budget no matter what. Pretty forward thinking for 1922.
Exactly. He was against being rigid with budgets. He said they should be used as guides to reach goals, not to just limit spending. He knew that estimates could be off, and adapting to change was important.
Okay, so maybe not as ancient as I thought, but fast forward to now, and we've got beyond budgeting. Sounds kind of intense. Ditch the spreadsheets, everyone trust your gut.
It's not quite that extreme. Beyond budgeting proponents, people like Jan Wallander and consultants like Hope and Fraser, they're still all about planning. They just say that the traditional yearly budget cycle can be a bit limiting.
You mean like setting a budget in stone for a whole year?
Hmm.
Yeah, that does seem a little inflexible in today's world.
Exactly. They're all about being more dynamic with resources, having more frequent performance reviews, and using benchmarks instead of fixed targets.
So instead of saying, here's your budget, don't go over, it's more like, how's your performance stacking up, and can we adjust resources based on what's happening right now?
Precisely. And that's not a million miles away from what McKinsey was saying back in 22. Both approaches get that the business world is constantly changing and you need to adapt.
But there's got to be some key differences. Otherwise, why even bother with a new name like Beyond Budgeting? Sounds like they're both after the same thing, making organizations more responsive and effective.
You're right, there are nuances. McKinsey's big thing was shareholder value, which, by the way, is something beyond budgeting folks still advocate for. But his approach to control was more about centralizing things. Beyond budgeting is much more vocal about decentralization, giving more autonomy to teams, encouraging a faster, more agile response to opportunities.
So more freedom and flexibility at the team level. But isn't that asking for trouble? How do you keep everyone on track? That's where this participatory budgeting thing comes in, right?
Yeah.
You hit the nail on the head. Beyond budgeting is big on empowering teams to make decisions, but it's not about ditching accountability altogether. Participatory budgeting, where teams have a say in how resources are used, that can be a really powerful tool in this approach.
Interesting. So it's about finding that balance between giving teams the freedom to adapt and making sure everyone's still moving towards the same objectives.
Exactly. And that's where understanding the ins and outs of these different approaches becomes really valuable.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see the bigger picture. But before we get ahead of ourselves, can we unpack this whole decentralization thing a little bit more?
Sure thing. Think of it like this. Traditional budgeting, it usually takes a top-down approach. Headquarters sets the budget, departments get their marching orders, and everyone's supposed to stick to the plan.
Right, like a well-oiled machine, or at least that's the hope. But beyond budgeting is basically saying scrap the machine.
Not scrap, exactly, more like re-engineer. Decentralization in this case is about moving the decision-making power out, closer to the teams who are actually doing the work. I mean, they're the ones with the on-the-ground knowledge, so why not give them the power to make adjustments when they need to?
Okay, I see what you're saying. But wouldn't that just lead to chaos? Imagine every team just spending money however they want.
That's a common worry for sure. But beyond budgeting isn't about just handing everyone a blank check and hoping for the best. It's about shifting from a control-based system to one that's built on trust and accountability.
Okay, so instead of having the finance team breathing down everyone's necks, it's more about trusting teams to be responsible.
Exactly. Beyond budgeting, fans say that when you give teams more autonomy, they tend to be more engaged, take ownership, and come up with more innovative solutions. It's about creating a culture where people are driven by the company's success, not just hitting some arbitrary budget number.
That resonates for sure, but it also requires a pretty big shift in mindset, doesn't it? I mean, for decades, we've been trained to think of budgets as the ultimate measure of performance. If you don't hit those numbers, well, someone's getting a talking to.
No doubt. And that's exactly why beyond budgeting can be a tough sell for some organizations. It means changing the way you think, moving away from command and control to something more adaptable. But those who support this approach say it's a change that's becoming more and more crucial in today's rapidly changing business world.
It does feel like the old ways of doing things aren't always the best, especially with the pace of everything these days.
Hmm.
But if we're not using budgets as the main yardstick, what takes their place? How do you even measure success in a beyond budgeting world?
That's where those relative benchmarks I mentioned come in. Instead of just looking at whether a team hit some random budget target set months ago, you're comparing their performance to other teams, their own past performance, even industry benchmarks. It's about looking at the bigger picture, getting at the why behind the numbers.
So it's less about hitting a specific target and more about understanding the context and adjusting as you go. It's almost like giving your budgeting process a little bit of nuance.
You got it. And that's a key takeaway here. Beyond budgeting isn't about throwing budgeting out the window completely. It's about evolving the way we think about budgeting, making it more agile, more responsive, and ultimately more effective in today's crazy, ever-changing business world.
Okay, so it's about evolution, not revolution. But this whole thing about beyond budgeting being the next big thing, it all sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Like we've heard it all before. It really is like that saying, everything old is new again. So is beyond budgeting just a catchy new name for ideas McKinsey was talking about ages ago, or is there more to it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It gets to the heart of what we're trying to do here. Cut through the hype and see what's really useful. And, sometimes just a fresh coat of paint, a new name, it can be valuable in itself, gets people's attention, makes them question things they didn't even realize they were assuming.
So sometimes you need that bold statement, like a, hey, think about this differently kind of thing.
Exactly. And beyond budgeting definitely does that. It builds on some of those fundamental things McKinsey talked about, adapting to change, using data to make decisions. But it also pushes things further in ways that might not have been as relevant back then.
Like with the decentralization thing and empowering teams.
Exactly. That focus on agility, on pushing decision-making out to the people who are closest to the work, that's a big difference. McKinsey's world was a different world. Everything moved slower. Information didn't flow the same way. Beyond budgeting recognizes that in today's world, everything's changing so fast, we've got to be able to make decisions quickly and empower those on the front lines.
It's like comparing a giant cruise ship to a fleet of speedboats.
Yeah.
They can both get you where you're going, but they work best in different situations.
Perfect analogy. And that's what makes this whole discussion so interesting. It's not about saying one approach is right and the other's wrong. It's about understanding what each one is good at and what it's not so good at, and figuring out what's best for your specific organization, your goals, your culture, all of that.
So if you're listening to this, wading through all these budgeting articles, what's the key takeaway? What should you be thinking about as you try to apply all of this?
Here's the thing. It's not about picking a side. It's not budgetary control versus beyond budgeting like it's some epic battle. The real question is what approach or what mix of approaches will help your organization do its best work in today's crazy and constantly changing business world.
So it's less about finding the right answer and more about asking the right questions.
You got it. Don't be afraid to question the way things have always been done. If your budgeting process is holding you back, if it's stifling creativity or slowing you down, maybe it's time to shake things up. Look into those beyond budgeting concepts, decentralization, relative benchmarks, rolling forecasts. See if they make sense for your team and your organization's values.
It's about finding that sweet spot between having a structure but also being flexible, right?
Exactly. And you never know. You might even find that some of those ideas from McKinsey, even though they're a century old, still make sense today. It's all about finding what works for you.
That's a great point to wrap things up on. It's all about finding what works for you, not just following the latest trend. This has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of budgeting, old and new. We've explored the history, the nuances, and hopefully given you some things to think about as you navigate your own budgeting journey.
And don't forget, whether you're sticking with a more traditional approach or venturing into beyond budgeting territory, the most important thing is to think critically. Don't be afraid to question, experiment, and adapt. That's what budgeting at its core is all about.
And I've said it better myself. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Until next time, keep those budgeting brains buzzing.